Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in. On this episode of the podcast, host Craig Jeffery joins Chris Gerda, Risk and Fraud Prevention Officer of Bottomline Technologies, to discuss the results and strategies from the 2020 Treasury Fraud and Controls Survey. Topics of discussion center around corporate fraud concerns, security spend, criminal innovation, and more key findings. Listen in to find out how to better protect yourself and your organization against fraud.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. This is Craig Jeffery. I'm the managing partner of Strategic Treasurer. I'm joined by Chris Gerda, who's responsible for the overall anti-fraud strategy and technology initiatives that protect Bottomline's PayModeX payment network. And I'm delighted to have him join me on today's discussion. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Thanks, Craig. Really glad to be here. Happy to discuss some of these results and some strategies.
Yeah, excellent. And thank you on behalf of Bottomline for underwriting this industry survey. It's the fourth year doing it. It's very great information for the industry at whole and individual companies. But let me just give a little bit of a background, and I'll start asking you some questions. So over 300 respondents took part in the survey from across all areas of all corners of the globe. Every region was represented with organizations there. It's the fourth year running, so we have some good information across time to see what's changed with defense methods, concern, investment in fraud. So there's a lot of great information. Chris, let's cover a couple of key themes from the survey, and I'll get you involved in that. So, just a couple things that probably aren't too much of a surprise to anybody who's paying attention to fraud is, first, the threat level keeps increasing. The attackers, those that are doing this are criminal rings or nation-state actors. They're getting far more sophisticated. They're leveraging automation, and we saw fraud attempts grow 50% over a 3-year period and reach, the majority of organizations. There is a continued multi-year trend on spending more or significantly more on defense against cyber fraud, payment fraud. I think these are very good. The second one's a very good trend. The first one is not so good. And, additional spending on the defense makes sense. But I also wanted to have you weigh in on some of the macro issues that either came out of the survey or come out alongside of the survey. What are you seeing going on in terms of themes at this point?
The survey brought out some themes that we were aware of already, such as BEC fraud or business email account compromise fraud. When you combine some of the survey results, you get a pretty staggering number. So our 350 respondents, 67% of them reported some BEC fraud attempts against their organization, 15% reporting losses. So if you combine those together, you're just over 80% of organizations that responded to the survey that have had to deal with BEC fraud in their organization, whether it's against their accounts payable department or whether it's some sort of CEO impersonation to initiate a transfer. I think that lines right up with what you said, and the threat level keeps increasing. More sophistication and the other piece would be the automation. So BEC fraud relying specifically on email hacking to spread the social engineering attempts to misroute payments. I think that the FBI is producing some good numbers. The Internet Crime Complaint Center, which is ic3.gov, puts out some really good BEC fraud statistics that align with our results. And you're looking at U.S. businesses losing approximately $300 million a month losses from BEC fraud. So I think that's one of the ones I want to talk about today as just a general theme as we go through things. It's the biggest impact against businesses today. What I saw in 2019 on a positive note was continued international law enforcement cooperation, which really started getting some heavy traction in 2018. In 2019, we had an Operation Rewired, which resulted in 281 arrests internationally, many of those out of Nigeria, seizing of several $1 million in funds, and treasure troves of information, such as the 250,000 stolen identities that they found on the people that they'd arrested and confiscated. So I like that this finally is coming into this phase of understanding and then being able to action against these organized criminal groups abroad. So really excited to see how 2020 shapes up as law enforcement's catching up to the speed and what used to be the anonymity of attacking across borders. Now we're going to get them.
Yeah, we've talked about the globalization of Treasury, payments, et cetera, and I guess we also have to recognize that there's the globalization of this fraud. It's across borders, and with your example of the international law enforcement coordination, that's a very very healthy sign. But yeah, what are some of your favorite or top findings from this year's survey?
Some other favorites, OFAC. So our survey showed that half of the respondents don't screen for OFAC. And so my comment on that is it's everyone's responsibility to screen for OFAC. For instance, and very specifically, it's not the bank's responsibility to do it for you and then notify you after you've sent a payment. It's actually your responsibility up front. Now, you may be using a bank's platform to do the screening, but you as a U.S. organization are responsible for that screening up front. And we saw some fines coming out in 2019 against U.S. corporations who, uncovered that they made payments to sanctioned entities, but they discovered too little too late that occurred. Their screening processes were very light or non-existent. So my comment on that and how to protect yourself is make sure that any type of screening you're doing is consistent and retroactive. And what I mean by that is if there's a new update to one of your customers and they've added a new administrator on the account or a new ownership, that you're scanning those new names when that happens. And anytime OFAC's putting out updates, those should be retroactively scanned against your entire client base that you're doing business with, especially in that international space. OFAC put out what they called a framework for OFAC compliance commitments this earlier in 2019. That's a great place to start for guidance. It gives you kind of a checklist of what you should be thinking about across your organizations: policies, technology, people, strategy, and it gives you a good approach to evaluate an existing program or a future program. Another stat that I thought was very interesting was ransomware. So we had some really interesting things there on the payments for ransom. And we saw a spike actually in December 2019 of ransom payments to decrypt infected systems somewhere around $84,000. And it's interesting when you see those numbers, even though there's a lot of subjectivity and statistical variance, size of organization, type of organization, the infection. But it's interesting to see them in general when people are putting that out there for everyone to kind of learn together. Patching and anomaly detection are critical there. And also having a business continuity plan that doesn't just account for what would be like weather crises or power outages, but really actually going into the cyber attacks and making sure that plan isn't so much a call tree, but is really comprehensive in incident response and crisis communication, who's involved, and how you get that out to customers. I think that 2020, if I had to make a prediction, we'll see more and more ransomware attacks against systems. They come out with kind of like the base virus, and then all these variants start coming out. So making sure that you're working with third-party providers that provide the best up-to-date patching and threat protections to stay current is really important and something to analyze constantly.
Yeah, you brought up a couple really good points, Chris. I mean, the fact that the losses went from, I think in 2018 it was averaging for ransomware under $10,000, and then we hit 2019 that scaled dramatically, and there was a big uptick at the end of the year. approximately an order of magnitude. So instead of 10K, just under 10K, it was just under 100K. That's a massive escalation of effectiveness for the criminals to lift that much more money out of organizations. So that was sort of the lower level yielding crime, and they've been able to leverage that and get the payouts high. I think that speaks to the seriousness of it for sure. What are some of the survey results that I guess are encouraging on reducing some of these fraud levels? I know we talked about multi-factor authentication when we were planning for this, and maybe you could talk about some of the things you see there.
Yeah, I think the multi-factor stats were encouraging, but I wouldn't say that they're good enough. So we saw about 44% of what we called non-wire payment platforms having multi-factor authentication on them to ensure layers of protection. And I would consider multi-factor authentication, which is a text to your phone or a push to your phone or hard token that you have the numbers on in your pocket, to be one of the most critical protections in today's environment. Not just payment platforms, but everything that's associated with your business. So one of the common phishing attacks today is against Microsoft Outlook credentials. We need to make sure we have multi-factor on all of our communication channels, because if your email's breached, there's enough information in there for a fraudster to potentially socially engineer your financial institution for access, right? So we have to kind of go to the places where they're going to go. So having multi-factor on email is important. The other piece of that is, and we did a little bit of statistics in the survey on corporate cell phone usage, setting up PINs on your cell phones, not to log in, but actually a PIN number with your cell phone provider that prevents that SIM card in that phone from being ported to another phone without your authorization. So you're essentially adding a type of multi-factor authentication to protect your cell phone, because we saw a lot of that in 2019, which was fraudsters actually convincing and socially engineering the cell phone providers to move the SIM cards, reissue SIM cards to your phone number, or your phone goes black and the fraudster's taken over your number, and then therefore they're able to pass those codes that are sent to you to get into your bank account. So having multi-factor on the payment platform is one thing, but we need to protect all of the channels that lead up to that payment platform for that thorough protection. And they're actually pretty simple steps that will really increase the mitigation. Unfortunate in a sense that every new technology that we come out with to help us in our jobs, you could see corporate cell phone usage increasing in the survey, is one more where we have to now retroactively and make sure that we're securing with our increased use of it, because the fraudsters are going to keep migrating to the technology that's new that might not be as protected or as matured as other ones.
That's scary in a lot of ways, right? As we add more layers of security, the criminals are sophisticated and they work to defeat those security layers. Hey, if I can take away those security layers, I get back to what I need. I guess that's a sobering reality of the sophistication, the persistence, in terms of how they're making this a business.
Yeah, absolutely.
We went through this data. Your company has underwritten the survey for 4 years, and we've been able to pull some interesting correlations. And correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, but there's a number of interesting correlations that exist that logically make sense. But the level of correlation is really quite interesting. I was wondering if you could, summarize what a few of those correlations were, and what can we then learn from them?
That's a great question. I think there's a couple prevalent ones. The first one that I saw in this survey was almost a 100% increase in the people that are using payment monitoring for interdiction. And what I mean by that is either they have a bank platform where they bank, or they're partnering with a third-party software provider to actually monitor for payments coming out of their ERP that fit certain criteria, and they're interdicting and stopping those payments before they either get to the bank or before they even leave the bank. And if you're thinking of it in the simplest of terms, You're stopping a payment to a new account over a certain dollar amount. And what you're assuming there is that the human element has failed. So if you've updated the account number for a customer, say a major construction firm, that you want to have a separate level of oversight from a different team that's monitoring these alerts over that change management process. So you're kind of forcing compliance, and now you're looking to see, did they do a callback when that account number was updated? Or did they just take information in an email, which would be that BEC fraud, and update the information? And what was the communication channel that they used to communicate with the client when the account number was updated? And you're slowing that down, and you're putting another set of eyes on it. And that's a really strong protection. And you can tune that in a way and volume that fits your organization and your payments that you send out and how many changes that you have. And it's just a great control. It's much easier to stop it before it leaves than to go get it after it's left the door. And I think that's a realization now, because BEC fraud has become so prevalent over the past 3 years. Another correlation that I think was there is training. So we saw some great statistics, and Craig, you and I talked about this a lot, and training and culture go hand in hand in organizations. So we saw some great firm-wide training across the board, whether that's online courses or investment in your AP or Treasury professionals to get additional training. And that just leads to doing the right thing. And if you have training in your organization, you generally have, as a correlation, good policies. And you're reviewing those policies to make sure they fit the changes that are happening over time. And with that comes those callbacks to those vendors who need to do a change, or really strong vendor onboarding procedures at your organization that go above and beyond. But what I think too, what training kind of correlates to is communication. And this would be makes a good program. Communicating within a training program about things that actually impact your organization, and then putting them at the training. So if you have real world examples that you see, putting that in the training is great, because it brings it really down to the level of people taking the training, like, this happened here. And when we look at the 80+% of organizations suffering from BEC fraud and attempts, taking some of those instances and transferring them right to your training creates an atmosphere that can't be duplicated with technology, and can only come from people, which are the first line of defense and also the weakest links, who should be constantly trying to strengthen that.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, from interdiction to training, and then diving into the training pieces. This idea of the human element being prepared is, I think that's behind the technology piece. Like you said, the amount of organizations that build in interdiction capabilities as part of their controls on the payment process are realizing a very significant lower level of actual losses, because it provides a benefit. On the employee training side, payment fraud, controls, and cyber fraud, this is where people are trained on more than be aware of phishing activity, but exploring issues of how the criminals work, their game plan, their approach, and explaining and understanding the different control principles that are necessary so that people comply with what they do, because whether it's business email compromise or system compromise, they're breaking down layers. And a couple of the interesting numbers we found in terms of correlation, if you have training versus you don't have training, if you don't have training, your likelihood of suffering a loss for ransomware is 5 times. And that's a massive number. And another example is for business email compromise, if you don't have training, your likelihood of a loss, or your experience with a loss, rather, the correlation was 4 times those that had training. And even when you get down to like payment diversion fraud or ACH fraud, that's 1.5 times or 2 times more likely to suffer a loss. Now, none of these reduce the number of attempts, because attempts are automated and consistent, But by having the human element trained, we believe that correlation is real and useful because people are stopping many of these items. They're either identifying something as suspect that they might not identify as suspect, or they're stopping things and avoiding violating internal control principles. So I think those are real good examples, Chris, of what organizations are doing that make a difference. You can spend money on systems, and you should. You can spend money on training, and you should. And the weakest link has often been the human element, which is why we see such a rise in things like business email compromise, which is spoofing people to do other things.
Yeah, the ransomware particularly, right? Thinking about the delivery method, that's coming at you in an email with a malicious attachment. And so it's really easy to see that correlate directly to training. I'm not going to click on this because I don't expect this attachment. Or this email has an attachment, and I know from my training, I'm really going to scrutinize the sender of that email. Is there an I where there's an L? Who do I usually communicate with? And they're picking that up. So we often, like you said, human is the weakest link in most cases, but on the flip side, humans are also the strongest link in some situations. It's technology. If you start relying on technology to protect you, it's going to miss. Like, not every email provider can catch every bad email coming to you, because those emails are actually coming from your trusted vendors who are compromised, so it's not blocking those. So people are always going to be part of that equation, and they're going to be the ones that find the toughest, most well-crafted malicious emails that are coming into your organization based off of their known relationship with the vendor, or based off of just knowing I don't ever get a link from this customer to click on, or I'm not expecting an invoice at all from this customer, or they deliver that invoice generally via another method.
I think when we were talking before, you said what makes for a good training program. I listed some of them. One was, understanding the different attack methods and strategies of the different criminal organizations, so that you're prepared. Looking at case studies seems to solidify thinking well in people's minds to say, oh, this is how they got around different security layers. And finally, a review of security principles in depth, not just the old traditional ones that everyone thinks about, like dual authorization, but other ones like the principle of least privilege, which I know you're going to talk about as another correlation. But finally, the other two things that I think are vital is that there's a testing element to the security training. So people are definitely paying attention, not just clicking through and letting a video play, but they're taking notes, they're answering questions, so that there's a certain level of learning. We all know that people are serious when they do that. And then there's a recurring aspect where there's refresher elements. People are doing this at least annually, getting updates to different attack methods. Those are big things. But the third correlation that I wanted you to just jump on was the principle of least privilege. And what did we learn with that in terms of a correlation?
Yeah. What system should I have access to, and do I have access to more than I need? And so if you're constantly evaluating that in your program, and you're ensuring that people don't have too much access, or they can't serve as a dual controller on things where they shouldn't be able to do so, if you have a breach, you mitigate those types of movements that a fraudster could do. That's really important, just across the board. And then where you put your dual controls at are also extremely important. I think, having that in place, it's protecting you against that worst case scenario of someone has duped you and actually got into your system, some sort of remote control of your system, and they have access to move your cursor on your screen, and remote access control viruses and specifically are what I'm kind of referring to. And if they can't do too much because of the privileges that user has, you restrict them a lot. And making sure that you have the dual controls to, I'm going to initiate a wire and this person's going to approve it, or I'm going to edit a phone number for multi-factor in my system, and then someone else has to approve it. Those all work off of the principle of least privilege being in place and not too many people having admin rights to do too much without oversight. It just permeates throughout any way a fraudster could impact you if you're constantly, putting that into play.
Yeah, I've heard people describe it as sometimes people think of if I just protect the perimeter, I'm good. But once people get inside the perimeter, if they can, let's say they get inside the fort, if you will, right? A fort has strong walls. Someone gets inside and they can move freely. They can do much more damage than if it's cordoned off or sectioned off so that you can only see the things you need to do. That, by design, restricts movement of information, movement of funds, and use of resources. So a real lot of emphasis, I think, on principle of least privileges is showing some good ground, Chris. Now, as we move towards the end of this episode, as we talk about fraud, you spend a lot of time helping companies reduce their surface, their exposure surface. You have a lot of stories about what goes on and what needs to be done. And I was wondering if you could, whether you're interjecting stuff from the survey or relaying some stories about, different topics that you care about in terms of getting the message out there about how can we be more secure as payment professionals, as treasury professionals, as finance and IT people. Maybe you could just cover a few of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple going on. One kind of a nitty-gritty one, on the ground, everyday AP that we look at, and another one's just really macro political level. So the nitty-gritty one that I think is important for everyone to understand is credential sharing within an organization. It occurs more often than people would like to admit. Two people or one person has the logins from two people. And it's because maybe you have a small shop and somebody's on vacation. And so payment initiation and payment approvals, user adds and user edits are all done by the same person. So one of the solutions that I've seen effective is the same one that we have in our consumer lives. And that is if you're logging in from a new device. So you get a multi-factor challenge, like from your bank when you're logging in. What happens is someone initiates a payment and they pass multi-factor to initiate the payment, and then they log out and they log in as somebody else. Well, what systems can tell now is that you have two different users logging in from the same device, which is extremely odd, especially if it's a phone and the system itself can block and lock multi-factor, shoot out alerts to management that this is occurring, and it prevents that type of bad culture type of policy interaction that you see when there's credential sharing in an organization. It also is very effective in breaches where multiple people might be affected. So fraudsters can't actually utilize multiple phished credentials. We'll be blocking along the line and alerting and snagging payments. So that's kind of a more technical one. But there are systems out there that can detect and prevent credential sharing within organizations by seeing that they're on the same device. Another story, larger level, right? The political one. I actually saw last month, January, the U.S. government, several senators got together and sent a note to the FCC. And they're asking them to opine and comment on the SIM porting fraud that became so prevalent in 2019, which is when fraudsters are able to socially engineer the cell phone providers, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, Sprint, into phone numbers being moved from one SIM card to another. The real person gets a blank phone, as I talked about before, and the fraudster gets access to everything in your life, because phones are the gateway to everything that we do today, in many cases the business world as well. That letter went out in the beginning of January, hoping for a response in February from the FCC. That one's one I'm looking toward seeing what they're actually thinking about there. because it's the first step toward government regulation over some of these critical factors that protect our lives that fraudsters are going after. There's some articles out this past month that fraudsters are now targeting and phishing for credentials from the cell phone providers, employees themselves, to access the actual system that does the SIM porting on the phones. That's extremely scary. And I'm not one to generally point out the fear elements of fraud. I'm usually tactically trying to stop them. But I'm really glad that we are, as a nation, starting to look at these things that are so integral to our lives. And you see a lot of politicalization and a lot of media reports about these large BEC frauds. You see celebrities affected, major companies, blue chip companies affected, and it's helping us all learn more about the scenarios and just become generally aware. So those are probably some of the top issues, interesting stories that I've seen lately.
Those are great. Chris, thank you so much for your time and for your support on Treasury fraud and controls and making sure companies are protected and safe. And I want to mention to all those listeners who took the survey, thank you. From Chris's perspective and my perspective, we really appreciate you taking the time. We hope you learned a lot from it. Those who did, their companies receive a more comprehensive report. For those that didn't take it, there's opportunities to take it next year, obviously, and to take other surveys. But you can still download an executive report that covers a lot of great topics. Again, thank you for your interest in protecting Treasury and payments. And Chris, thank you so much for your leadership in this area.
Thanks, Craig. Very welcome.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.